So it's a joy to be here with you all. And I'm just thankful that I was invited and extended this invitation. I'm a pretty new person around here. So I want to tell you a little bit of me and maybe why Janice tapped into me to talk a little bit today about, especially for Dia de los Muertos. By vocation, I'm a hospice chaplain, and also I've curated Day of the Dead altar exhibits for many, many years, and I would have to say before Coco. So before Coco, I was 2003, I was doing cardboard box cemeteries outside of a Mexican cultural center called Mecca. It's in the 6th Ward. And so that was my work. I was trying to bring this beautiful knowledge across the border. And some of the neighbors would say, that's very interesting, colorful skulls. And, that kind of hadn't been seen in Houston. So they would tell me, very Mexican Halloween is very good. And of course, it's taken many years to finally, and it's understandable that there had to be that cultural education. And that was the mission of the organization, multicultural education and counseling through the arts. And so that was fine. I didn't take it in any way offensively to have to explain, no, it's not Mexican Halloween, it's Dia de los Muertos, Day of the Dead. And so that celebration, it was just such a joy. And I was trained as a visual artist. And so when they kind of, as it is, usually when you're in an organization that is not really fully staffed, they kind of, here, do this. And you kind of, oh, yes, I'll go do that. I don't know anything about specifically curating altar exhibits. But it dawned on me as I was doing it and as the community was bringing their items. And so, I had to mark out spaces and where people would do altars, many spaces. And then I'd have to realize that, the height and the depth and all this situation. And I was concerned. And I was like, I'm originally from Nicaragua, so we don't have that tradition. So I was willing to be educated myself. And so it was just beautiful to see. But one of the things that I started seeing when people brought the items and they were crying. They were really moved. And I was, I hadn't really connected to it. I had been observing or kind of taken in. But then I began to see that the arranging was arranging things inside. So as people were decorating, they were moving grief. And they would bring the shoes and food, which we don't have. This ofrenda doesn't have anyone's personal belongings. It has pictures, but people would bring shoes and cigarette lighters and, things like this, and food. But people would come with crying, and I would, beyond just being there to kind of hold space for them in a business way, I began to have a conversation. And they would tell me about their loved ones, and they would tell me about their dearly departed. And so then began for me to know that I really want to, my skill set was not where it needed to be, as somebody who could hold space for grief and grieving. And I knew it was time for me to move to kind of join art and spirituality together. So it was, okay, I get art and I get, cultural things, but I'm moving things and moving energy in a way that I'm not sure I can adequately support it. So began my journey into inviting more of a spiritual connection. And interestingly enough, I said, I think my vocation is more on the spiritual side and more artistic. And so I started to, I went to seminary, and I was really called to being a chaplain. And being a chaplain in spaces where it wasn't an institution, I wanted to be a chaplain more like in community. So I began to see myself as a kind of chaplain and for Dia de los Muertos, rather than a curator, or perhaps both. So kind of both of these passions joined, and I felt better prepared to support people on the artistic side, on the spiritual side, and just listen to stories, which I think is really the biggest part of being a chaplain, to listen and to witness grief. And so the stories that have been, I don't know, just if you want to raise your hand, have any of you been to Mecca to see the altar exhibits? You have? Okay. So I would encourage you, it's the biggest now. The last one I did was in 2017, but now it's the biggest altar exhibit in Houston. It's really gone on to do amazing things. It's grown, from the days when I was pushing carton box on the front yard. And I'm so happy to do that, to have done that. And I'm happy that Disney did such a wonderful job. I think it was interesting because I would talk to a lot of people about Dia de los Muertos before Coco. And even people in Mexico would say, well, we don't really do that except in little towns do that, little indigenous towns. We don't, and I always thought that was odd. And I really think that Disney, for all the things we may think, Disney kind of helped Mexico wake up to its beautiful tradition. So where now it's a protected celebration, a world-renowned celebration, and part of human heritage. It's taken care of by UNESCO. And so it is a very protected and beloved holiday. And so I think what I titled this talk today is Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, a healing feast for the soul. So I'm going to give you some exact reasons or specific reasons of why this is a healing feast. And I'm not necessarily promoting, I tell people, I don't necessarily, the takeaway is not that I want everybody to go and do an altar in their home, although that would be great, but to take the time to develop a relationship with your ancestors, with the people that came before you, with the people that we may not know. To develop a relationship with them is absolutely key. And I think that in this other vocation that came as a result of doing the Day of the Dead and the cultural aspect of it, it's teaching me, being a hospice chaplain, this thing that's teaching me how to make a living, it was teaching me how to have conscious dying. And I really think the task now, moving forward in my life and after doing many festivals and serving the community at end of life, is to realize that I also need a tool for conscious dying. And the Day of the Dead is a tool for me. Now, it's a difficult idea to put out in the world because no one really likes to talk about that. But it's a reality. I like to think that the more consciously we live, the more consciously we die. And I have great news. And one of the amazing things that I have found about end of life and death and dying is that our biology will help us. I used to be afraid of, oh my goodness, how am I going to endure this vocation and end of life? But as I began to work with people, listen to people, I began to see near-death experiences that have happened. I began to really see that it isn't so bad. Not that we're ready to go, but when the time comes, you will be helped. There is grace. And the neat thing, and I heard a palliative care doctor, very spiritual doctor, he said, your biology will help you. You will know how to die. And I think that's great news, because I was always thinking it's going to be some kind of struggle or fight. You live consciously, you will die consciously. That's the beauty of it. It's like life and death it's a mirror. And I've now learned that from my many visits with patients. One thing, and I wanted to, but if you notice, this is a little sugar skull, right? So symbols have become so, I'm now really attentive to symbols. And what do they mean? What are they showing us? And after I've been so many death visits now, the one thing people crave before they die, sweets. But maybe there's even some of you here who have a loved one who wanted an apple pie, double chocolate fudge cake, vanilla ice cream, vanilla bean, and it's like, what are the patients call? That was always, I start writing down the unique things that I'm seeing, the patterns that are repeating in death visits. And it's like people want to take the sweetness of life into death. I want to take a bite out of the sweet. I want to go with the taste of sweet. And so I think Day of the Dead is an encouragement for that, not only for our past and our ancestors, yes, but also for our own conscious dying while we meet them. And so I appreciate the symbol of the sugar skull because it's taking that sweetness. The death can be sweet. And a little bit later, I will read to you a funny story about a book I brought, because the title of this is Healing Feast. One of the ways that I heal my own relationship with my ancestors, one of the ways that I heal my soul through Day of the Dead is laughing, humor. So I have two interventions, which I've called them interventions by now. If there's our patients that are open to laughing and having humor at end of life, I encourage that. And there is. And I've heard when we have our IDT, what we call in hospice, which is our interdisciplinary meetings, when we meet with the doctor and the nurse and the social worker, we meet and I encourage them to tell me funny stories. And we also talk about, so can we talk about grief and humor? Yes, and it's very Mexican. Very Mexican. Mexico, there is this fun idea about death. Not in a disrespectful, I would almost say even mocking, but it's not a making fun of death. It's a, you know what, death, we know you're going to get us, but haha, we're going to have fun anyway. And if you've seen in Mexican, you have the, how about that, Mauricio? Is that about right? Yes. And, you've seen the skeletons and they're, dancing. They're like, come get us. That's okay. We're not afraid of you. Come on and take us. We're going to continue on in the afterlife and be happy. And so Mexico has this attitude towards death that is unique. I was having an end of life, I created an end of life loteria, which is Mexican bingo, but I reimagined all the topics to end of life topics and death and dying. And I started doing it just a couple of weeks ago at Mecca, and I was doing it with an elderly couple from Mexico, and they were like, why be afraid of death? We're not afraid of death. This is part of life. In Mexico, there's a saying, se nos adelantaron. That's what you say when someone dies. Se nos adelantaron. They went before us. So there's a humble recognition. Not they died, Oh, they died. Well, in Mexico, you almost like you have to, I'll put this here before anything. In Mexico, you almost have to kind of have a humility. They went ahead of us. You kind of integrate yourself in their journey. Well, they died, but guess what? They just went ahead of us. We're not too far behind. It's a kind of a way to, there's a word, cultural humility, which we have to have, but I think in Mexico it really is, I find it there. They have a sense of humility about end of life and death, and I really, really appreciate that in Mexico. And I was just in Mexico a week ago. My aunt is passing. My aunt that raised me as her daughter. And it was so interesting to me. She sent me on an errand to get her something to eat, and she is already pretty much almost gone, but still with us for some reason. She's still hanging on. So she sent me on an errand, and I asked her, I said, well, would you like me to get you? And she said, get me an apple Gerber and a guava juice. I said, okay. So I'm coming down to get that from the little store. And I said, that's what she fed me when I was a baby. And it really dawned on me that this was a cycle ending for her and a cycle ending for me. And the food that she had fed me was meeting me. And this sort of deepened my own connection to her death, to her life, but to her death. And I think we have to have a connection to life and know how to live, but no one teaches us how we're going to have to die, and die good. And I long for that. There are teachers, and I seek them out. And so they're there, they're kind of underneath the radar. If you're looking for them, they will manifest, because when the student is ready, the teacher will show. When you say, I'm ready to learn about, how to proceed in my life's journey towards a courageous aging and towards a conscious dying, because of course our ancestors are showing the way. They show us how to live, but I also hope that they show us how they died. And my aunt was showing me how to die. I'm so glad for the examples that I can take away from her life. But the way she's dying now, that is so incredible to me. The way that she's so serene, so peaceful, just accepting. She has stomach cancer, so that's not an easy disease to live with or to die with. But dignity all around. That's a life lesson. And I find in our culture, we're taught how to live, but we're not really even want to think about, how do I consciously die in a peaceful way? And that is what I appreciated about this trip to Mexico. And I appreciate that about this, about Dia de los Muertos. So even if you don't say, well, that's great, I learned something about the culture, take this away from Dia de los Muertos. The greatest lesson is, how can I, this is the question, how can I live now so that my going away is a blessing? Not a tragedy, not, my going away is a blessing. Yes, people will be sad. There was a TikTok that I couldn't get over how beautiful it was. I don't recommend watching TikTok, but I could not get away from this one. It was an Italian funeral, and they had the hearse, and the hearse was open, the casket was in there, and people were dancing, just dancing. And I thought, how beautiful. They're going away. This person provoked a sense of celebration, joy. And yes, I want people to be sad, but I also want them to dance. And today I'll have a humor share. because I want you to heal through humor, but I also want you to heal through dance. So be ready, because I want you to dance a little today. Dance the bones, right? Move the bones, because one day they won't move. And so I'm really excited. So I want to explore the therapeutic and healing aspects of Dia de los Muertos, offering insights into how this vibrant celebration can aid in the grieving process and provide a framework, joy and sorrow. And I knew for this church, that's really, I had felt it from the visits I've been coming, and there's always this framework in the services, joy and sorrow, joy. And the paradox of those two emotions, that's the transformative key. The juxtaposition of joy and sorrow, that's the transformation. That's what is going to heal the emotion. And so Julie sang La Llorona, which I'm amazed, and wow, what a beautiful. I am so thankful, because that's a complex song, and it's the weeping woman, in case you didn't know, the weeping woman. So there's a sense that, yes, Day of the Dead is sad, and we're thinking of our ancestors, but I also want to end with, what's the takeaway? What is the takeaway of my life? What is the takeaway of Dia de los Muertos? So Day of the Dead is for the living. Day of the Dead is for falling in love with life, reflecting on the dead, so that we can have how do I want to go? So it's for the living, and falling in love with life, because life is beautiful. The more I celebrate Day of the Dead, or the more that I learn about conscious dying, I become a happier person. I feel like that's my antidote to depression. It's kind of counterintuitive, thinking about death and how, but the more I think, the more some inner grace just fuels me, and I just feel joy. So there is a sorrow. I didn't say there wasn't. But again, the joy and sorrow together, that's the transformative journey. Okay, so one, I'm going to just really quickly mention them, because then I want to go through the real quick little story I want to read to you about humor in the end of life. So grief and rituals. So Dia de los Muertos is a powerful testament to how rituals can aid in processing grief. As I was saying to you, when people would come, the fact that they were arranging the table, putting the ofrenda, crying, what they were arranging on the outside was arranging things on the inside. It was moving that grief. So remembering and honoring loved ones. I think coming and bringing a picture, it continues building that relationship with people who have passed. And I think now that I'm landed on 50 years of age, now I'm aware, what is my relationship to death? What is my relationship to life? What is my relationship to my ancestors? These are the great questions of aging, of coming of age, which I'm so glad I get to ask. So also, that's number 2, remembering, honoring loved ones. Integration of loss and joy. So being part of this celebration is help us to integrate love and loss and joy. Community support and togetherness. When I was in Mexico, they have so many rituals and community support celebrations. I was part of a seriada. Seriada has to do with wax and wax candles. So it's homes, they designate a neighborhood, and all the houses have an ofrenda, a public one, and they're all lit. It starts at a certain time, and you're going uphill, because this happened in Ocotepec, which is a pretty hill, mountainy town. And you go up and you go into everybody's home, and you see the ofrenda, and you give them a little candle, and they fill your jug with, coffee or some hot beverage. But in that way, you're witnessing that family's grief, and they're pouring back to you. But it's so beautiful, because number one, the ofrendas are just outrageously beautiful there. But just that you're just having that sense of, I see you. I see your grief, and I grieve with you. So community, so art therapy and expression. So art plays a central role in Dia de los Muertos, providing a means of expression and healing. And so there's so much art going on. And here, when I did the Day of the Dead, I invited the Art Institute of Houston to have a fashion show. And several years, I just invited the students to do fashion show and explore their creativity through, dressing with the Katrina. They would do this type of costuming. And I would also talk to them a little bit about, death and end of life, which I think young people are very ready to talk about that. Narrative therapy and storytelling. And this is where I will stay for the next few minutes to tell you a story that is funny about end of life. Okay, so sharing stories about our loved one is a vital part of Dia de los Muertos. And so storytelling is a therapeutic tool in helping us cope with loss, preserve memories, and integrate our loved ones' narratives into our own. Okay, so there's a bit going on. So I'm going to share with you just for a minute from this book called Exit Laughing. Okay. So Exit Laughing is a book, and it says how humor takes the sting out of death. Okay, so some of you may think, it's okay. It's a little dark, and I apologize if you feel, oh, this is a little dark. But I'm just going to say for 1 minute, because I know it's almost time to wrap up the service, Into the Light by Barbara Lodge. The reason I chose this story, because it sounds a lot like what we go through or what I see in my hospice visits. So I'm just going to read a couple of minutes. My father died first when he tripped and fell in a parking lot. I figured he needed new shoes, so we got black Reeboks with extra tread. He wore them to work daily with his gray pinstripe suits, white button-down shirts, and black knit ties. Trend-setting, he would say, stylish and comfortable. He proceeded to buy them by the dozens to give to friends and family. 2 months later, while wearing his new black Reeboks with the extra tread, he fell again. This time he suffered lacerations on his face, warranting dozens of stitches. Several doctor's appointments later, he was diagnosed with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. There was no cure. I picked up because it just sounds like the familiar scenario when we get an admission in hospice. There was no cure. Victims usually die of respiratory failure within 2 years. Paralyzed, unable to eat, speak, or move. Soon after his diagnosis, he invited me to breakfast. I loved having breakfast with my father. We sat on the same metal chairs with the same lemon needlepoint pillows at the same Formica table in the same sunny yellow breakfast room where we had eaten my entire life. It was a Saturday morning. My mother was out playing bridge at the club, and he was wearing his navy wool robe, flannel pajamas, and leather slippers. On this day, this usually dapper man looked disheveled. As we ate our eggs, he said, "I've been thinking, my work here is done." I had to breathe and stay steady and calm, so I took his hand. Muscle spasms bumped up under his skin, tiny electric shocks, signaling nothing good. His nerves were firing at random intervals, similar to the engine of a car sputtering before it wears out. He'd made up his mind. "Where I'm going is a happy place," he said. "No," I said, "it's not time. You're only 83. He assured me he was unafraid and that his mother would be waiting for him. When he was 45, he was pronounced dead during surgery. He described the blinding white light and his deceased mother standing in front of it, her loving arms outstretched. I had to believe him. My father was the exhale to my inhale and taught me that anything was possible. So before this disease stole his body and left his brilliant mind trapped in a paralyzed shell, he was going to move on. I had no say. 4 weeks after our breakfast date, he'd sit in his black leather chair, eyes closed, emptying his mind. Whenever I'd blow into the room, hoping to regale him with stories of my children, he'd respond, "Shh, silence is okay, too." So I'd sit next to him holding his hand, already feeling the loss of my father. "Tomorrow will be the big day," he announced to me and my mother, exactly 2 weeks after revealing his plan. My mother was appalled and would have none of this ridiculousness. Again, this is all sounding like a lot of my hospice visits. And she called all 3 of his treating physicians who'd become personal friends, asking them to come over. So they all come, and as they left the bedroom, one doctor said, "I'm going to see my sick patients now." So he wasn't really dying, but he had made up his mind. Late that evening, he told me to go to Tower Records right away and buy a Barbra Streisand CD containing the song Memories. I didn't understand his urgency, but he had faith. He knew what he was doing. I gathered my purse and made for the door. "Stop. You're going nowhere of the sort," my mother snapped. "Don't you know the kind of people who go to Tower Records on the Sunset Strip at this hour?" I ignored her reproach. Apparently, I was the kind of person who did just that. My father's body was about to give birth to his soul. When I returned with the CD, my mother was fuming in the other room, and my dad was still very much alive, serene, and comfortable. He lay on his back with his eyes closed, me curled up next to him, hoping he'd both succeed and fail. When his breathing became almost imperceptible after several dozen run-throughs of the song, I leaned over closer and whispered, "Are you dead yet, Daddy?" He opened one eye, looked around the room, and said, "No." We exploded into hysterics, our laughter cutting through all things death and dying and returning us to the simplest form of one another. We held hands and laughed off and on for hours. At 2 a.m, he pressed me to go home to my sleeping children. I didn't want to, but acquiesced, only after he promised not to stop his heart until I finished carpool. He started manifesting his plan the next morning as I was dropping off my kids at school. I sensed a shift and sped to his bedside while holding him in my arms. I felt a rush of energy sweep out of his body, and I knew we would never, ever be separated. Death may have ended his life, but it didn't end our relationship. For days, even weeks after his passing, I saw and felt miraculous, life-affirming energy in all aspects of nature. My therapist suggested that such experiences of mystical wonderment, even ecstasy, were nothing more than dissociative denial that my father was actually gone. He said, "You haven't grieved his death and are trying to ignore the emptiness of your loss." So she decided she was good at this death thing, and she now feels like she's going to go be a hospice volunteer and so on. So this little story, and I'll end it right there because it is time, it just shows that there can be humor in this very difficult time, and we can find those humorous moments even in those end of life. So I hope that you take that away and just up your game with humor, because there is humor even in those times. And so when you think about end of life, don't do that. Just go, "Yes, I will embrace it. I will, whatever it takes, I'll find the humor and tell good stories, because they will be there waiting to be made." And so I conclude with that, and thank you so much.